My name is Roy Martin. I'm a master mariner and a researcher. I'm especially interested in little known incidents from the Second World War. When the Dunkirk evacuation ended on the 4th of June 1940, about 140,000 British servicemen were still in France. All but 15,000 of those were rescued in the next 3 weeks, as were many Polish and Czech troops and many civilians. Most of the ships were merchantmen, and this rescue remains largely unknown. The main operation was codenamed Ariel. Within it were several dramatic individual voyages, and this is one of them. The tramp steamer Broome Park had arrived in Bordeaux on the 13th of June 1940 with a cargo of coal. This was the day before the Germans entered Paris. After discharging, the master was asked by the British consul if he was willing to embark 500 refugees. He agreed, even though his ship only had the most basic of amenities. As it was, the ship was only called upon to load just over 100 passengers, but some brought with them cargo of immeasurable value to the British in their forthcoming isolation. The ship sailed from Bordeaux at 6 a.m. on the 19th of June 1940, making the trip down the Gironde without pilot or tugs. Captain Olaf Poulsen was born in what is now Oslo in 1878. He'd made his home in Scotland, becoming a British citizen in 1904. Poulsen would have reflected on how the war had changed his fortunes. Made redundant in 1938, he was now in command of a new ship, with probably the most valuable cargo ever carried in a tramp steamer. He also carried passengers who would normally have only been seen on a liner. Poulsen and his officers knew that the invading Germans could arrive on the northern bank of the Gironde at any time. The only photograph from there, the ship appears already to be shabby, with her hull painted with hastily mixed grey paint. She proudly declares her identity by flying her signal letters and the biggest red ensign she has, where the gaff would have been on a grander ship. The men had slept on the hatches or in the 'tween deck among the coal dust, so most looked like coal miners emerging after a shift. The women and children occupied cabins vacated by the ship's officers. A piratical figure with several days' growth of beard was the centre of attention. This was Wild Jack Howard, or to give him his full title, Charles Henry George Howard, BSc, 20th Earl of Suffolk and 13th Earl of Berkshire. He wore a grubby overcoat and walked with the aid of a stick. The coat covered a pair of pistols and tattoos that only sailors acquired in those days. At 17, Jack had served for a year as an apprentice on the final voyage of the last of the big sailing ships. After a short spell as an army officer, Jack migrated to Australia, where he farmed for several years. The man with him, Major Ardell Vautier Golding, wore the uniform of an officer of the Royal Tank Regiment. Though he had made the same perilous journey across France, Major Golding was shaven and smart. At 37, he was 3 years older than the Earl. He gained his BSc in mechanical engineering at the University of London. He had joined the army, where his record shows that he was frequently specially employed. Major Golding was in fact a member of military intelligence. With their secretaries, Eileen Beryl-Morden and Marguerite Nicole, they had formed a mission to Paris, only leaving when it became an open city on the 10th of June. Now they were supervising the safe stowage of the valuable records and equipment that they had saved. They had also organised the evacuation of most of the scientists who were on the Broome Park. Two of the others on the deck were the bulky Lou Kowensky and Hans Halband. They had brought with them 187 kilos of heavy water, deuterium oxide that agents of the French Secret Service had smuggled out of Norway. It had first been sent to the laboratory of the French physicist Jean Joliot-Curie. When the Germans invaded, he had told his colleagues to get the heavy water to Britain, where they were to continue their work. This consignment was all that existed. Also on deck was the banker Paul Timble, the managing director of the Antwerp Diamond Bank. He had saved 2 crates of gem diamonds, which he transported first to Brussels and then to Paris. Timble believed that the total value was between £1 and £3 million sterling. The diamonds were stored in a small cabin next to the master's accommodation, with the heavy water. An armed sentry guarded the door. In addition, there were 33 French scientists and technicians, many with their families. The ship reached Le Verdun on the river mouth just before noon. There they loaded ammunition for the guns, and as the anchored ships turned with the tide, a French passenger ship exploded and sank nearby. The shocked passengers now realised the hazards of the voyage, and it was decided that the ship should delay no longer. Timble watched the receding coast with a heavy heart, for he had promised Ernst Oppenheimer, the boss of De Beers, that he would also bring the diamond cutters with him. On the Broome Park a raft was built to house the diamonds and the heavy water. The idea of this was that it would float if the ship sank. Timble says how handy the Earl was, squarely hammering in the longest nails to make the raft. Suffolk and Golding dictated a document setting out the precautions they had taken to ensure the survival of the most precious items. Only a French version exists in the National Archives, probably because French was the common language. The paper was signed by those in charge of the heavy water and the diamonds. Some have suggested that the wooden structure on the port side deck of the Broome Park, just forward of the bridge, was the raft, but this is unlikely, as the photograph was said to have been taken while the ship was in the Gironde before the raft was built. The Broome Park went to action stations after an aircraft had attacked the convoy, which was now about 30 miles away. Then an aircraft appeared overhead, so the passengers were herded below into the 'tween deck. It was safer among the coal dust than on the exposed upper deck, but had the ship been torpedoed, most would have drowned. Paul Timble describes the raid, saying, "We were going full steam, straight at the enemy. The British flag was flying proudly. I shall never forget the captain, a Scotchman, who stood bareheaded on his bridge, quietly smoking a pipe. And later, the captain, leaning against a bridge, continued to smoke his pipe calmly. His bronzed face of an old seaman was lit by the setting sun, towards which we were heading in a straight line." Kowarski says the Earl was limping around the ship, providing the seasick with champagne, which he said was the best treatment for the condition. This intrigued Kowarski, who felt that this was in keeping with a P.G. Wodehouse character, but Jack Howard was no Bertie Wooster in need of a Jeeves to keep him on track. They arrived in Falmouth at 6:30 on the 21st of June. Timble recalled, "We were in the middle of a bay. In front of us, in the bright sunlight, were green meadows and friendly houses. I couldn't restrain my emotion. I almost shouted to my family, 'We have arrived in England. Our journey is ended.'" The harbour was crowded. On one day there were 97 ships in the River Fal. This account is taken from my book, Suffolk Golding Mission, A Considerable Service, and was produced by my friend Stuart Bradbury. Next time, from Olaf Paulson's tramp steamer to King George's Castle.